welcome back. I hope you had a good break. My name is Janet Rich Edwards, and I am one of the two science advisors to the Radcliffe Institute here. And I want to welcome you back for what was a great start to the program and a really interesting second panel now focused on solutions. I'm going to introduce Anula. Jayasuriya, right? Very good. Who is the co-founder of Evolvence India Life Science Fund, founder of EXXclaim Capital, and I think possesses more Harvard degrees than anyone I've ever met. She's going to lead us off and moderate the second panel. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm especially delighted to see so many young women, and we are all hoping that what we're talking about is relevant for you. Let me, in case you missed the first panel, let me just go over the outline here is that I will speak for a very short time. Each panelist will have 15 minutes to describe their vantage point, and then there will be Q&A for 15 minutes afterwards. Please line up and state your name and your affiliation when you ask your questions. So thank you for panel number one for giving us a teaser into panel number two as we discuss solutions. And let me also first thank Nancy Hopkins, who was the first person who taught me about transposons and jumping genes when I was in college. I was a Radcliffe alumnus. And then I read the issue of Nature from 2013 that describes her struggle to bring light to this topic. And today I'm delighted to actually see her again in person. Thank you, Nancy. And Harvard and Radcliffe Institute, thank you for having me here. So Deborah gave us a suggestion that I want to emphasize. Start practicing. Don't wait to be asked. Ask to go to the prom. Invite the person to go to the prom with you. Don't wait to be married. Ask the person to marry you. Good practice. Ask. And when you ask, expect to see some people very surprised and not necessarily very happy. But be resilient and stay to the point. I'd also want to talk a little bit about what Alison talked about. I brought a series of articles, and among them was the venture investors prefer to fund handsome men. There was maybe it was apocryphal, but there was a follow-up that said that beautiful women were the least likely to get funded. And so that was another part that was quite interesting. Then I have an Economist article that's talking about the weaker sex, and they're not referring to women. They're talking about boys and education. So the pipeline for high-achieving men or for men at the school level is problematic. Right, and it's quite the opposite in women in college and in higher education. So that is also an ecosystem aspect that we have to think about. Now let's talk about boards. So again, this panel will talk about it in more detail. But I think getting on boards is very important. Deborah talked about the two people. Helena Morrissey, who is from the financial services in Britain, is a very interesting woman. She has taken a different point of view. You may all know about boards in Europe, where the Nordic countries have required a certain number quota system. And she has taken a different point of view. She's calling it the 30% club. And she sees 30% of board leadership among women as being the critical number. I don't know where she pulled that number out, but that is her. And her strategy is to go to powerful men in Britain who are chair people or chairmen of their boards and make them recruit the women onto the board. So she's taking a softer sell, if you will, rather than the quota system. I'm of two minds about mentioning this, but she does happen to have 9 children. And she is very successful. That does astound me. Another headline here, female VCs, what do entrepreneurs really think? So this data suggests, and it all comes from the power perception, that men and women entrepreneurs often think that male VCs have more power. So they prefer to be funded by male VCs based on this belief in power. And there is the corollary to that, which is also that for less than 5% of venture capitalists are women, and there's, I think, lots of data on social behavior where you like what's like you. And so it's also harder for women entrepreneurs to raise money. Perhaps some part of it has to do with it being that it's men, primarily men, making the decision. Also, something that I think about a whole lot is that it is hard for women who are climbing the venture capital ladder, which is a delicate ladder for women, to espouse women, because there's the complex dynamic of, are you espousing these women because you're a woman, or do you really believe in their company? So there are all kinds of subtleties that one should think about. And this article, we just know this, women are not making progress in the male-dominated VC world as data show. So right there is a pretty pervasive bias for entrepreneurship, because the eye of the person who's making the judgment. And that brings me to the unconscious bias world, which we will hear about here. And that is that if the system is geared towards measuring one group of people at their talents, it is fairly unlikely to work just as well in another group that has different characteristics. So, and that brings me to the Economist article from January 23rd this year, What's Holding Women Back? So this study showed that majority of Americans said that they thought men and women were equally capable. However, and so they believed in meritocracy, democracy, equality, all those wonderful things. However, P.S., when it came to being asked, would you have a woman lead, they're using the word viscerally. Viscerally, Americans resisted letting femininity and power go hand in hand. And their conclusion was, in our minds, we are open, but at a gut level, which is what unconscious bias taps into, this is a very hard leap for people to make. Then there's the aspect of various corporations making statements, bold statements. For example, Intel has appointed Renee James and given her a $300 million budget to increase corporate diversity, a lot of it being amongst women. Now, I live in Silicon Valley, and there is a lot of talk in tech, not in biotech, in tech, about getting more women. And there are bloggers who are talking about it all the time, people judging companies by their lack of women, a big spotlight. I may be just unaware, but I don't believe quite that level of focus has been devoted to biotech. Perhaps it's because there are more biotech CEOs and more senior women in biotech, but that doesn't mean that harsh light shouldn't be focused on the issue. So I think it would be good to do something that Nancy Hopkins tried to do, and we should carry the baton and actually blog, talk about this, let people hear that the dissatisfaction with the status quo. Some suggestions might be to give CEOs incentives for recruiting women to boards or recruiting women in their companies. There could be other ways to make this more interesting. And I'd also share with you, this is an N of 1. I was trained as a scientist, but I'm now a business person, so I can use N of 1. A woman who had been at Genentech and at the FDA, and also was a research scientist, said to me, you know what, I decided just to start my own company. And I didn't just start my own company, I developed the relationship with the funder. I maintained that relationship as my relationship with the funder, so that gave me power, and power was an operative word there. So enough from me. Let me introduce our panel very briefly. We're very fortunate to have a very diverse panel representing all the different stakeholders, just like panel 1 did. We have a policy expert, a PhD biologist who's a venture capitalist, and then we have Robin, who is an academic. So Victoria is the founding executive director of Women and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Their mission, led by Victoria, is gender equality to improve the lives of women across the globe. Anne is the Senior Director of Investments at Sanofi-Genzyme Bioventures. She has a PhD in systems biology from MIT and also did a postdoc. And she also went to HBS. Anne can speak to the transition from PhD academia and also to the role that venture capital might play, in particular corporate venture capital, because there are two breeds of venture capitalists, and represents the corporate strategic venture capitalists who are somewhat different in what they look for than the institutional venture capitalists. And then furthest away from me is Robin Ely. She's professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. And I had to get over saying I went to the business school. So, and I got laughed at a lot in California. Professor Ely will be presenting research on how HBS is tackling the issue of its previously not so hospitable culture for women. And Dean Noria has taken this on as an initiative to make HBS a more inclusive environment, and this has been led by Robin. So we really would like to hear your views, Robin, on this, on ideas. So we will then ask each panelist to speak for 15 minutes and express their views, and then I will take questions for 15, and then after that, it'll be your turn. And please come up with lots of good questions. Victoria.
Thank you so much.
So we've had a really robust conversation this morning, and our entire conversation has really focused on how do we navigate systems. At the Women in Public Policy program, we have been working for nearly 20 years not on measuring where the gaps are, though we certainly do some of that work, but how do we identify and find replicable interventions to close those gaps? How do you determine what the intervention will cost, how effective it is, and where can it be applied? This is a panel about solutions, and we're going to talk about where is the edge of what we know about how solutions work and how to implement them. My goal is over the next 14 minutes, I will give you some things that you can do within your organization. Now, because we can't immediately fix all the systems, having conversations about how to navigate them is extraordinarily important and impactful and needed. And we today are particularly talking about gender, but I think it's very important to remember that what we're really talking about is any non-traditional actor in the system. Anyone who breaks with the stereotypical frame, and I'll talk about that in specificity in a few moments. So we had discussion in the earlier panel about how are women leaders perceived. This is Heidi Roizen, CEO formerly of a very significant tech firm. There was a case written about her for HBS, and some of Robin's colleagues thought, you know, our students are reacting to this case in such a way that it really gives us pause. And they decided to take this case about Heidi and substitute Howard for Heidi, and very similar to what Allison talked about, where nothing else changes. And it's a beautiful experiment, right? Because we have students that we can put in one place and students we can put in another. We can change it over time period, but keep everything the same. And what they found is when the behaviors are identical, people like Howard more. They think Howard is a better leader. They think they learn more from Howard, and they want to work with Howard more. Now, Kathleen McGinn's work, which was that, also focused on warmth versus competence. When Deborah talked about how people are seen within organizations, and when there's lots and lots and lots of women, it's okay if there are some women who are tough and hard and abrasive, and it's okay if there are some women who are warm and friendly, assume both competent, and they can be viewed as competent and. But what happens when you only have a few, which is the way most people read our entire cultural narrative, and let's talk about predominantly in the West, because that's where most of these studies are from, that the entire cultural archetype is that women are either warm or competent, either beautiful or a really good venture VC. And part of what one needs to do is to create systems. So right now we're talking about, the past has all been about how to navigate the system. Navigating the system, again, very important. But the future is about designing systems such that individuals don't have to work so darn hard to navigate them, and so that organizations don't have to constantly operate in a system set where they are likely to produce sameness, which means they're not capturing the talent. Several times it was mentioned, and I'm going to call out Deborah again, that this isn't a problem about equality or diversity. We could have a conversation about equality, and that's a really important conversation, but I myself and the Women in Public Policy program, for 20 years I have worked on gender issues. I work in the White House with the Council on Women and Girls. I work with the State Department. I work regularly with all kinds of policy positions. I chair the Commission on the Status of Women and Girls here in the state of Massachusetts. All day I focus on how do we take interventions and turn them into policy. I almost never talk about equality. When one is trying to create change and one has stakeholders, it is very difficult to convince your stakeholders that you should take your eye off the ball for what you're required to do, take your eye off performance measures and outcomes that you will need to present and perform on, turn your time and attention to an issue which may not impact you in direct ways that you can understand to solve a problem that I believe is important that isn't on your list. Do we agree that that sounds like a hard sell? What is incredibly strategically effective for organizational change and organizational design is to understand what is the main mission of that organization. What are the key problems that they need to solve? What interventions do I have that I can convey that are replicable and ideally inexpensive, that can solve a problem that is on someone's list to enable them to reach their main mission? And that is the future of organizational design and closing gender gaps. And I'm going to give you a few examples today, and then I'm happy to take Q&A about them or any other topics. And we often draw upon behavioral insights. Now, does anyone know what that picture is of?
A tree.
Someone said it. Say it loud. Nice work. Petrified wood. Now, we've talked today about how few women are at the top of that pyramid, and everyone in their mind can see that catalyst pyramid with just a few women at the C-suite, and then the number of women broadens out as that pyramid goes down into the lower levels. One of the things that we do when we talk about how bad it is, and I've been showing that pyramid for years, so I am culpable. I'm in the tank. One of the things that we do is we normalize behaviors. Now, I show you a piece of the petrified forest because years ago, they used to have signs up. Has anyone actually been there? Okay, you may recall it. Signs up that would say, please stay on the path. Do not go off the path and put pieces of petrified forest in your pocket. 4 tons of the petrified forest leaves every year in small pieces that people gather. Now, what happened with these signs is that the number of tons of missing petrified forest did what?
Went up. Increased.
It rose. Because they literally gave a step-by-step guide of how to take it. And most importantly, they said everyone is doing it. And what we need to now do, there was discussion about 2 being the number on boards. Another way of looking at it, we can say most boards have around 20-something, only 2 women are on them. Low number, negative story, or I should say negative narrative. Equally positive narrative, equally accurate, more positive narrative, excuse me, is to identify that most companies, depending on what country you're looking in, 70% of countries, 80% of countries have women on their boards. The actors who are behaving in ways that we do not find desirable need to be presented as the outlier whenever it is accurate. So part of it is, how do we tell people what they should think? People want to be in the regular group. We all like to think that we want to be really special. Our behavior does not demonstrate that. Our behavior demonstrates we want to be like everybody else. Now, how do we get to the good outcomes? Old boardroom. Wonderful study by one of our former researchers at the Women in Public Policy program, Erin Deer. And what Erin focused on was, where in the organization do you want to put your gender interventions? And he looked at how you may have noticed on the back of your prospectus or buried towards the end, there will be a disclosure about the diversity policy for the organization that you are being asked to identify and vote for who they've put on the board. As soon as an intervention is about compliance, not main mission, compliance, no action follows from it. What his study showed wasn't that you had low effect, you have 0 effect consistently. Once something lands in the OGC's office, and this is something we have to do, and it's not about what we have to provide to our stakeholders, no change takes place. And you can end up with rooms that look like that, or your rooms remain looking like that. Now, how is it that we get to a very vastly different situation? Somebody earlier had talked about what it's really about is talent management. And when our wonderful Dean Cohen from the Radcliffe Institute opened her remarks, she talked about how the education gap has reversed. In the United States and in Europe, and over the next several years in South America, the majority of those to get high school, associates, college, and postgraduate degrees are all female. So what that means is the talent force is female. The larger the company and the larger the government, the more they are aware of this. The larger the government, the larger the company, the more likely they are to reach out to me or one of my colleagues to try to understand, how do they do it right and both access talent pools and hire, retain, and promote. Recall and remember, women, we are not an interest group. When you look at the talent market, we are literally the whole ball game. So, what we see here is an orchestra. There's wonderful work done by Claudia Golden examining what took place when all of a sudden orchestral auditions took place behind a screen. I will summarize. The number of women who were selected in final rounds went up 30%. And this is for a task which everybody understands. All you want is to hear the music. an incredibly disassociated task in terms of whether men or women could do it better. All you have to do is hear it. Now, we can't replicate having a screen in every hire that we do. But several things take place. One, hiring in bundles. Those of us who are here from industry understand that initial classes which come into organizations tend to be more diverse. But that diversity doesn't carry forward as we move people up in organizations. Why? If I asked you today, and I want each of you to think, you can have anything you want for dessert at dinner. Can you each think of it? Janet, I'm going to pick on you. What would you like for dessert? Pecan pie. If I ask you to fill out a calendar for every lunch and every dinner for the next 12 months, will you only choose pecan pie? Of course not. When people are hiring in bundles, they understand and have awareness that they will want diversity. But when people are hiring for one-offs, they tend to want what their favorite is. Favorite is a substitute word for what Allison talked about as well, which is people want to hire for what they view as male tasks. What tasks are male and female are defined by culture. There is nothing innate about them. And we know this because they vary by culture, by region, by time period. But we don't like breaking that gender stereotype. So what we know, moving on to this terrific paper by WAP's director Iris Bennett and her colleagues Max Bazerman and Alexander Van Geen, is that when we look at one-off hires and one-off promotions, the non-traditional candidate does very poorly. One-offs are never measured against another live person. They're measured against a fictitious norm. It is really hard to beat a fictitious norm. Really hard. So what happens is when you compare more than one candidate, and you can easily build processes within companies where you look at multiple people at a stage or time period. And I say time period because you can't always make that hire or promotion in multiple departments at once, but you can look back over time to compare against other former candidates. And once you're looking at real data, the effect of bias goes away. Then we begin to compare Janet's performance with Rebecca's performance, or Janet's performance with John's performance, and women do very well with no bias effect, which, by the way, is a huge finding. We would expect at most it would be mitigated but not go away. And I have lots of other things I could go through, but we're going to skip all that, and we're going to jump to policymaking for a moment. Big solutions require systems design. And I gave you a couple examples of ways you can redesign systems to help people get over their bias. Let me also note, this is not a guy-girl problem. This is not something that bad men do to women. This is a problem that each of us is pickled in the culture that we live in. It is very easy to put the cucumber into the brine. It is nearly impossible to get the brine out of the pickle. Men and women hiring officers underpay women at the same rate. Female CEOs provide really significant role modeling effects. Role modeling effects dramatically change the fictional norm in one's mind. It gets recreated. And it gets recreated in really spectacular ways, which is why there's incredible tools that can be used. And you can find, oh, this is a really great thing. I'm out of time, but I'm going to share with you anyway. As we talk about recreating what things look like. Now, here's an ad. I don't know if anyone actually saw this ad in your journals, but this is a woman who's an engineer. She was in this ad and got really awful feedback, Facebook and Twitter and so forth. And she started a hashtag of, I look like an engineer, and all of these different women have joined in and recreated what it looks like. And each of us keeps culture And each of us sits in a position where we have the ability to begin to change organizational design. There are some of us who sit uniquely placed, and I just want to share as my final comment with the audience, it isn't enough to think about what are the opportunities for the change I can make. It's about what are the responsibilities for the change I must make. And identifying where you have the power and the impact and the ability, and then who do you reach out to and how do you ensure that you consistently have the tools that you need? Everything I've talked about today is the types of things that I and my colleagues go and talk to leaders about. And we thought, how do we bring this to scale? How do we turn this from a conversation that I'm having with Valerie Jarrett and her key advisors, or with the governor, or my colleague Iris Bonet is having with the Cameron administration, to something that anyone can have access to and any person in any organization can do? And we created what's called the Gender Action Portal. All the research I mentioned today and hundreds of other studies, which are all experimentally based, they are not best practice, they are not views, they are experimentally tested information, are on the Gender Action Portal. Every paper is summarized in layperson's terms, all the way down to one sentence, and then to one screen, and you can link and see where the study took place. You can link to for my colleagues who will want to read the entire studies, soup to nuts, and understand all the methodology. There is a methodology summary, but there is also, you can go to the full paper, but it provides tools that you can use, and it's all searchable by general public topic conversation topics. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of my co-panelists and from hearing from your questions.
Thank you, Victoria. And I would like to invite you to make your comments.
Thanks. It's an honor and pleasure to be here today. I've just been super excited about the presentations and the discussion that we've had so far, so I'm excited to contribute my thoughts. So to kick off, I thought I'd address why developing the strategies and solutions is important in economic terms from my perspective. So as you may know, we're currently living in the longest open IPO biotech window. I would have made the same statement in February, and we are 6 months later. The past 3 years have been the biggest, most lavish party. The NASDAQ Biotech Index went up 54% in 2013, 34% last year, and hit 34% earlier this year. In 2014, 74 biopharmas entered the public market, raising $5.6 billion. As a level set, if we added up all the IPOs from 2008 to 2011 for those 4 years, only 42 companies went into the public market, raising only $3.6 billion. For the first half of 2015, we've already had over 40 biopharmas enter the public market, and they've raised $3.8 billion. As a result of this strong IPO market, the venture capital firms who invested in these companies started making distributions to their limited partners and to themselves. The reported gross IRR for the biopharma venture industry from 2011 to the first quarter of this year is 70%, with realized gross IRRs over 100%. This, in turn, provided venture investors the ability to raise new funds, and raise new funds they have. In 2014, the biotech venture community raised over $9 billion. As a level set, if you simply look at 2013, the far more usual $4 billion. At the end of Q2 2015, the venture community had already raised almost another $9 billion halfway through the year. And you might have noticed OrbiMed's news yesterday announcing a new $1 billion fund in their SEC filing. Furthermore, the venture community is deploying these funds. 2014, companies raised $6 billion from venture. The industry norm is usually somewhere between $4 and $5 billion a year. And as anticipated, 2015 is tracking to outpace 2014. In the first half of 2014, companies raised already $4 billion in venture. Interestingly, the number of new deals is holding steady, so the size of the deal is increasing. So the wealth creation and real distribution over the past 3 years has been tremendous. So, who is capturing the wealth? Let's start with the management teams. We've talked about this today, so I'll just add my 2 cents. If you look at the 30 biopharmas that entered the US public markets in 2015, of the set I looked at the other day, 1 of the 30 had a woman as the CEO, thanks to Jill over at Catabasis. If you look at the CEOs of the 91 biotechs who had venture financings in 2015 so far, 11 of the 91 have women CEOs, that's 12%. And looking at the boards, here I just looked at the private companies in our portfolio, and I was encouraged. 40% of the companies had a woman on a board. Wow. That's the marketing message.
That's nicely stated.
However, if I looked at the number of women board members relative to the total number of board members, 6%. So let's look at the investors. And looking at the 40 firms that raised new funds in 2014, 2015, located here in the US, roughly a quarter of the funds had women partners. And looking deeper at the early stage active institutional funds that I work with, these 18 firms had 120 managing or general partners, and 11 of them were women. That's 9%. So the wealth creation story I've described has been developing and playing out over years. It's real and material the past 3 years, and there are scarce few women in this story, but people are making money. So let's move on to thinking about creating strategies and solutions for increasing access and likelihood of success. So as we know, Boston is the dominant biotech cluster in the world, in large part because of the meticulous, well-oiled innovation system that we have. The parts include entrepreneurs, management teams, investors, academicians, and others. And increasing the achievement of women in all parts of this ecosystem is critical to a robust net gain. So I'll offer 4 areas to consider for enacting change: where it all begins, recruiting, marketing, and investing. So area 1, addressing where it all begins. And here I reference the work of Nancy at MIT and others. Nancy found that women faculty participation in company founding was about 5% relative to their male colleagues. From experience, I deeply know that whoever the founding academics are deeply shapes what that company will look like for its life. The academic founders are the #1 employee in the early stage biotech. Their interests, their vision, their personality, and who they call the investors, the entrepreneurs, is critical to how the opportunity evolves. So I would encourage the continued work in that area. Area 2, recruiting, building leadership and management teams, a pipeline for success in biotech. So here we've already heard some thoughts. I think experience, credibility, and network can be built very effectively in some of the larger organizations. They may provide the development opportunities, the experience set, and importantly, a place where you can build your network before moving into what I'll call less normalized environments of early stage biotech. I acknowledge the points on the network versus hierarchy, but I do think there are a lot of benefits to being in a large organization with resources you can readily harness. Successfully transitioning women from these institutions into the early stage innovation biotech ecosystem as senior executives, I think is something we need to work on. Here I'll highlight a group that I've been involved with for many years called Springboard Enterprises. It's a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to supporting women entrepreneurs and startup executives. They have excellent mentorship, access to an incredible network of alumni and partners and investors they've built up almost 2 decades. The level of experience doesn't matter at Springboard. The platform is open, whether a woman is on her 3rd startup or her 1st. She has no years of experience or she has decades of experience. The platform is there to be used. The 3rd area that I offer for enacting change, marketing successes and creating new frameworks. So I hope this is very much along the lines as what's been discussed already. The community needs to market success stories to expand the phenotypes that fit success in the minds of the investors and of senior executives. So the New England Venture Capital Association, the NEVCA, the Regional Venture Capital Group, the director who just recently left, C.A. Webb, I thought made excellent strides in the last 5 years to help the New England venture community market its own successes, and she paid particular attention to the success of women. I'm very interested in who's going to be the new director of the NEVCA, because the success that I feel CA has put in that organization over the past 5 years has been tremendous. Area 4 is the investing community. Here, I think we can take advantage and continue to foster the changing landscape in the investment community. So just a couple words on the traditional institutional venture capital community. The industry knows it has a problem, and it's trying to take some steps to address this. But you can imagine it's pretty hard when you've been raking in cash for the past 3 years. So in 2011, back pre-boom, the National Venture Capital Association, the singular Venture Capital Industry Association of the US, surveyed investors in the US, and 89% of the investors were male and 11% were female, as I think has been noted. In 2014, the NVCA took its first steps and formed the Diversity Task Force on the lawn of the White House and committed to developing meaningful solutions to support diversity in venture firms. We'll see. The first report is slated for the annual meeting in 2016. I think they have a nice group of people who are on that task force, a combination of people, I think, who can put forth some really compelling suggestions that I hope at least a large chunk of venture firms will be able to adopt and will speak to their interests, which, let's be clear, institutional venture capital, your job is to make money. In the meantime, with the boom that's happened, there has been a tremendous growth in alternative financing sources relative to the traditional institutional venture capital. And I think you can start to see this as you've watched, as you see the migration of the institutional venture firms into pockets where they used to sort of own everything that came out of the universities. It's a very interesting migration that's been happening over the past 3 years. Family offices, angel investors, and angel groups were often the sort of the stepchildren of the industry back in the day. They were often retail moguls, media moguls. That's who sort of belonged because that's who had money. With the boom, successful biotech executives are now part of those networks. They do financings for companies. I think many people know that some of the Genzyme executives are now the angel funders of many biotechs that have started in Boston. So what's been offered by the venture firms is now resident in some of these alternative financing sources. That is, highly sophisticated investors that know the business, have the networks, and have capital to make them successful. Another source of capital that used to be the odd man out in traditional venture is the corporate venture capital group. Today, nearly every major pharma has a corporate venture team doing direct investments in companies. Many of these teams know and live the business because that's what they live. They have the relevant networks, and they have the capital. So just as a level set, the R&D budget of Sanofi on an annual basis is $5 billion. On a usual year, that's the amount that's deployed into the entirety of the biotech venture capital industry. So small changes in pharma R&D allocations can have major impact on early stage biotech investing. And as some of you may know, the intense hunger of the pharmas for innovation and the recognition that much more innovation happens outside of your walls than inside of your company's walls has already begun to drive change. So there are many other new sources of capital that are having major impact. Some of you may have been following the amazing work of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, MMRF, Michael J. Fox Foundation, and JDRF in contributing these different sources of capital into early stage biotech. So in closing, the new world that's been created during this heyday of biotech, I think, presents challenges as well as incredible opportunity. It's important to understand the magnitude of how women have participated so far in this process of wealth creation and distribution. And the examples that I've given of groups, associations, Springboard, the NEVCA, all these groups are working very hard on the 4 dimensions that I've outlined. So what's left to be done? Other than these individual dimensions need to continue to push forward. I think similar to what others have said, it's the orchestration of the ecosystem to lead to a successful business outcome that we're still missing. So to be clear, venture capital is a club. The founders, the investors, the board, the CEOs, they're very preset and have long-standing decades of history because you trust each other that you're going to make money at the end of the day. So how can we create a new way to orchestrate the ecosystem to achieve a successful business outcome and support the value proposition of why these companies, these investor groups, need to look different? And I think we can do this in 2 different ways. How do we orchestrate, as has been suggested, at a system level, more of the structural level, and coordinating changes and sharing across these different groups what's happening so that we can have the impact together. And then the other level at which we can orchestrate the ecosystem is at I call it, as we were talking earlier, Deborah, sort of the get it done level. So the entrepreneurs, the investors, the founders, the academicians, and the executives, the guys get together and talk about what it is they're going to do. Why don't the girls get together and talk about what they're going to do for their new company? And I say that in the sense of not to the exclusion of any one party, but this is how it happens. So I think we need to recognize that. It's been a successful model, and let's maybe try to replicate that with a slightly different combination of people at the table. So I hope this has given some ideas of the value proposition or the business outcome, and I hope that we can see some real change, and maybe there's an opportunity from this forum to come together to push forward on some of these ideas for better orchestrating our own ecosystem, which in Boston, if we make a change, the rest of the world will notice.
Thank you, Anne, and I'm glad that you're so upbeat. And Robin, please.
Sure, thank you. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's been really interesting to hear all of the other speakers. And I go to a lot of these conferences, so I don't say that at all of them. So what I'd like to talk about today is just to give you a little bit of background on how I see the problems with women's advancement. Where are the barriers? I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural context that is outside of the organization, the culture within which the organization is situated, and then I'm going to talk about how that culture seeps into the organization to create a context that creates barriers for women. And then I'm going to talk about a case example. So this is the Harvard Business School Culture and Community Initiative. We've been over this ground a little bit, but I thought I would just summarize it. I think it speaks to some of the findings that we heard about earlier. So these are the kinds of messages that we get, men and women. We associate leaders with these kinds of traits, competitive, assertive, decisive, and we associate women with a different set of traits like warm, nurturing, and communal. And the clear problem here is that there's a disconnect for women and leaders, but not so for men. So you can just kind of replace man and leader and get pretty much the same thing. This is, I think, the message in a nutshell. I don't know if you can read it. It says, but when a woman has someone's head cut off, she's a bitch. So I actually think that this might be that badass woman that we talked about earlier. And I do think that in reference to some of the things that Allison reported, that these are the messages that, that women are getting, that if you take a position of power, there will be some negative consequences. So it's not surprising to me that she would find what she finds, and I would attribute it to this cultural context. Here's another message that we get. So the cultural ideal, if it's not to be a woman in power, it is a mother who quits her job. And this is, I take this from the cover story in 2003 of the New York Times. Lisa Belkin wrote an article which put basically opting out into our lexicon. It really has caught on. We did a survey of Harvard Business School alumni. We have a sample of over 5,000 of them, and gave them a bunch of different possible reasons for women's stalled advancement. And this was the one that most people agreed with, that women prioritize family over work. So 75% of our alumni believe this, and 82% of women. So women were actually more likely to endorse this as a barrier, a reason that women are not making it. And I always like to point out when I present this slide that I really think everybody prioritizes family over work. I don't think this is a woman thing. It's what does that actually mean to people? And to men, it very often means being a breadwinner, so he's going to ratchet up at work. And for a woman, it means to be a caretaker, so she's going to ratchet back. So it's not about prioritizing family over work. It's about what the culture, how the culture describes what that, sort of tells us what that actually means, and it's very gendered. Okay, so that's the larger cultural context. Now I want to talk about the organizational context. We talk about gendered norms and practices. So for many years, we had just basic, good old-fashioned sex discrimination. We still have some. But we call that now first-generation gender bias. Those are explicit, intentional forms of discrimination and bias. They're against the law, and we don't see them as often as we used to. What we're really seeing much more now is what we call second-generation gender bias. This is implicit bias, it's unintentional, and it basically comes from the fact that most workplaces were designed to fit men's styles and life situations, that the organizations are filled with practices and policies and norms that appear gender neutral, but that when they're enacted actually create different patterns of experience for men and women, and they add up these sort of micro practices and interactions. Laurel talked about the interactional situations that women and men find themselves in organizations are quite different, and that's what I'm talking about here. And those are the things that impede women's advancement or push them out altogether. I should say I don't have time, but I have a lot of data also to suggest just on that point of pushing women out. Yes, women are pushed out more likely than they opt out, but they're actually not opting out at the rate that we might think they are. So I can speak to that later, but I didn't have time to go into it. So a little bit more about organizational context before I get into the case, just to give you a sense of what I mean. So I'm going to give you some quotes. These are things that I have heard in the course of my work, or my colleagues have heard in the course of their work on gender issues with companies. So here's a healthcare company, and a woman says, I sat in a performance review and actually counted the number of times women were described as nice. That was never a point of discussion about the men being reviewed. Okay, so this is the manifestation of what I was talking about earlier, that the fact that woman doesn't equal leader. In a financial management firm. As soon as I started working at home 1 day a week, my performance reviews went down despite the fact that my clients were happier and I got more work done. This is irrational. But we see this kind of thing happening all the time, and it's a result of that other piece about the cultural ideal of who women are. And once they go home, once they have children, they're seen as less committed workers. So there's research on that as well. Here's an accounting firm. In year-end evaluation sessions, a woman was found a little bit short, and we didn't see how she was going to get there. A man was found a little short, but we could figure out how he was going to get there because he looked like me. This is a man speaking, and I knew what I looked like 5 years ago and what I needed to grow into this. So this is the kind of thing that happens because of the demographics of organizations. And another one from a consulting firm, our job postings seek for perfection. Men who don't meet all the qualifications apply anyway. Women hold back. So this is an interesting one because in this company, we were talking to them about how this was a gendered practice and problematic. And they said, oh gosh, you're right. You know what we should do? We should tell the women they should apply anyway. You know, they should just inflate what they, like what the men do. And we were like, well, you could do that. You could change the women. Like that's what we always want to do is fix the women. Or you could actually post a job posting that was realistic. Imagine that. That's what I'm talking about when I say, that organizations are gendered, and my emphasis and that of my colleagues is to actually change those practices. So just to kind of highlight a few things here, these are practices, performance reviews, year-end evaluation sessions, job postings, and then we see that there is a disproportionately negative effect that those practices, which would appear gender neutral on their face, have on women. Okay, so remedies. So we hear a lot about unconscious bias training. This is sort of the darling right now. I think in particular in high tech, Google's doing this, so everybody else is doing it. So increasing awareness of bias, reducing discrimination, of course, instituting work-family accommodations. We know that's a double-edged sword. Well, mostly it's negative because it produces a kind of flexibility stigma. People who take them, and it is mostly women, end up being stigmatized and their careers are derailed. And then this is an interesting one. So somebody who was at Davos was telling me about a dinner that he went to. Actually, it was a dinner that Sheryl Sandberg had, and she had apparently it's quite a competitive thing. It's like who goes to whose dinners, and there's only 2 or 3, and who shows up at yours, and blah, blah, blah. So this person was saying he had gone to Sheryl Sandberg's and was very pleased to see there were all these CEOs, and it was attracting a lot of attention. That's great news. But the thing that was problematic, which he noticed, was that they were all talking about this, oh, well, we know how to solve this problem. Now that we see it, of course, we'll just address it. So we'll set some benchmarks, we'll set some metrics, and we'll hold people accountable, and the problem is going to go away. So unfortunately, that's not going to happen, which worries me a little bit because I don't know where their energy is going to go when they find out that actually it's not that easy. So the perspective that we take is that accelerating women's advancement is deep, ongoing, transformational work. This is culture change work, and it's very hard. So I'm going to give you an example. We're like about 4 years in, and I would say, we've made a tiny bit of progress. So I just want to start there. This is like a huge success story. I'm not going to claim a lot of progress here, but I do think that we're on the right track, and I think there's something to learn from it. So we call it the Culture and Community Initiative. It really was generated from faculty recognition of this historical gender grade gap. Some of you may have read about some of this in the New York Times. I'm going to try and set the record straight because actually what was reported was not really accurate. But at any rate, so there was this gender grade gap. We'd had it for years. It was something that was publicly known because we list the students who receive the Baker Scholar Award, which is based on grades, and you could always just count the number of women in the list and compare it to the proportion of women in the class, and what you'd find is that women were underrepresented. They were about half. So the thing is that it was never publicly acknowledged, and then there was a faculty meeting a number of years ago now where one of my women colleagues stood up and pointed this out. So of course we would always be whispering about it next to each other and talking about it behind closed doors. So it wasn't public. I think it was very important that she raised this. She asked the question, she put it on the agenda. People got very uncomfortable. Nobody really wanted to sort of think about why it might be that women were getting lower grades because of course the underlying belief from many of my colleagues was that they just weren't that good, well, diversity is really important, but you have to lower standards to get women in here. We have a forced grade distribution, and somebody's got to be at the bottom in every class, and it's going to be the ones who are less good. It's going to be the women. Okay, so that was, I think, the story out there that was not voiced so publicly. But we also had a disproportionate turnover among women faculty. There were a couple of years where we lost a lot of junior women, and and that was quite noticeable and quite disturbing. So in 2010, Dean Nithin Noria was appointed, and when he was putting his priorities together for his administration, he talked to every faculty member and was very surprised at how much these first 2 points came up in the conversation. So he made inclusion one of the school's 5 priorities, and he came to me and asked me if I would head an initiative, and actually he asked me to head, he had in mind something very similar to what had been done at MIT, and that we would write a report, we would take a look at ourselves, and we would make this report public. So we've done everything but make the report public. It's still on the table that we might, but it hasn't happened yet. He created the Culture and Community Initiative and a new leadership position, which he appointed me to. So here's the mission of that project. So it's to cultivate a culture in which all members of our community can thrive and reach their full potential for advancing the mission of the school without compromising excellence. And so all members of our community are faculty, students, and staff. And we define culture in this this is in the sociological literature. Sociologists would recognize it. It's basically the way we do things around here. And the underlying assumptions of our approach, I think very similar to what Victoria was saying, is that we really need to come together around something that lies at the core of what the organization does and what people are invested in, the reason they're in the organization in the first place, and that they actually want to be held accountable for. So it's really about mission and purpose, and gender disparities. So the fact that we saw, these underrepresentation of women on our faculty or in grades, that's an indication of broader system dynamics. So those are presenting problems, but those are not the problems that we are oriented to solving. We're actually oriented to advancing something that is larger, and that to advance that, we have to address these other issues. So I don't have time to show you this video that I just love of my dean. So, but if you just Google W50 Dean Noria, it's the first 2 minutes of the speech that he gave at the close of the summit that we had in 2013, which was part of our commemoration of 50 years since the admission of women to Harvard Business School. And you will see a person who is demonstrating incredible commitment and passion, and I think that that's really important. So let me just say a little bit about these, the 2 projects that we undertook. There was a student culture project and a faculty culture project, and Susan Sturm and Heidi Brooks were our collaborators with me on the faculty culture project. So I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to go quickly through this because I started with the grade gap. It was public. I want to address what happened around that. We did think about, as we undertook this project and we were aware of the gender grade gap, it wasn't that we were just focused on our mission isn't really to get good grades. Our mission is to educate leaders who make a difference in the world. But we thought maybe this grade gap was an indication of something else in our culture. So this metaphor of the canary in the coal mine, you send the canary in, and if it dies, there's something toxic in the environment. That was the kind of thing that we were thinking about. That's how we thought about the grades. So we investigated the causes, and I'm very pleased to say that after a very careful quantitative analysis that was reviewed by just about everyone who had an investment in seeing the results one way or another, showed that it was not student qualifications. So the gender coefficient, after we ran the regression, adding in absolutely everything you could imagine that we could control for, most people thought that gender coefficient would go away once we put in GRE quant. By the way, GRE verbal is more highly correlated with it, but it turns out that that coefficient went from here to here, really didn't change at all, and that really opened people's eyes to the fact that, gee, maybe something was going on. I think that was the most important thing that has come out of that project. We, in the course of this, we raised awareness. So there were a lot of ongoing practices that were designed to increase effectiveness. The New York Times article talked about these practices as if we had undertaken them to close the grade gap. That's not true. We've had a grading tool for a very long time. We've had scribes in and out of the classroom, and we were undertaking curricular innovations as part of another of the dean's priorities. So if you haven't read the article, these were all the kinds of things that you could imagine would help to address potential faculty bias in the classroom. What I think happened, because these things had been, it wasn't like there was an intervention and then things changed. These things were always happening, but I think that they were now engaged with a lot more consciousness of gender, and I think that's an important lesson, that there has to really be an intention around the practices that get changed. So one indicator of success is, yes, the grade gap did diminish. I think more importantly, the students are really now owning the culture change process. I'm gonna have to go through this very quickly. So on the inquiry and the culture, the faculty culture side, rather than looking at quantitative data that we had, we hired an external team that interviewed 120 faculty. What I think is important to note about what we did with respect to this project is we started out by looking at the culture of our school. That was our real question. How does HBS operate? What are the cultural norms? What are the practices? Who's thriving? Who's succeeding? What does it take to thrive? And what are the critical junctures or turning points in a person's career? And what we know in probably all organizations, but in knowledge work in particular, so this is academia, yes, but I think there is a connection between what happens at Harvard Business School and academia more generally, and what happens in industries that are around knowledge work, professional service firms, and so forth. Key experiences around feedback and evaluation, relationships are absolutely crucial to advancing. And so these were the topics of these interviews. It wasn't about what's going on for women. And by the way, we weren't just focused on women. It was a culture and community project, so we were really looking at any sort of systematic groups that were systematically less able to thrive. We conducted a network survey. We identified patterns in the different in the ways that different groups were experiencing thriving versus not thriving. It was at that point that we came in and looked at race and gender and other identity differences. So the intervention, the analysis was conducted and conveyed with an eye to actionability. Just a quick example, one thing that people have noticed is that women tend to sit on their working papers. You can't get published if you don't send the working paper into a journal. And so there was this women are sitting on their working papers. So the immediate interpretation is, well, they lack confidence, they don't want to send it out. That's not so actionable, right? What are we going to do about that? What was really important was to say, well, why? Why are they not? And then to get some sense of, well, who are they talking to? Well, actually, a lot of them are disconnected from faculty, from senior faculty who can help them shape their papers and get them, and help them figure out when it's time to send it in. And so we think that maybe there was something gendered like that going on. We shared the full report with the faculty. Again, it's a consciousness-raising story. And what we've been doing since then is basically identifying what we call high-leverage task domains, where we can experiment. So looking at, okay, we've got this whole story about our culture. We see how it operates differently, systematically differently for different groups, including women, but other groups as well. So where are really the pain points? Nobody's going to undertake to change a culture, especially one that, by the way, we love our culture at Harvard Business School. But we recognize, that there are some issues. So it's really important to identify where is it that people have energy for changing things, and where is there actually leadership in the organization to take up some of these experiments. And so that's what we've been doing. I don't have time to speak about some of the experiments around developing teaching skill. It turns out that that's a big leverage point. It's a place where a lot of people fall off, both men and women, but it might be disproportionately women for a variety of reasons. And so experimenting with different ways of teaching people how to teach, and that seems to be quite effective. So I'm not going to be able to, I've gone way over, so you can just read these. and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. That was a very weighty and meaty and content-rich presentation. I don't know how many of you know, but the ambient temperature in companies was set for the comfort of the man in the gray flannel suit, and it has not changed. And also, there's data that suggests that fathers are considered more committed to their work when they're fathers rather than when they're single, whereas mothers are considered less committed, which is interesting, plays right into the gender stereotypes. But Robin, I would love to continue your conversation there. You had made a quick question is, you mentioned that married women had less of a grade gap than unmarried women in class. And I was married when I was at HBS.
You were safe.
Yes, I was safe. And if you could give me a quick answer on that, and then I have another question.
Yeah, so we were having just a sidebar conversation. It wasn't something I mentioned, but it's true that in these quantitative analyses, what we learned is that there was no grade gap and had not been between married women and men. And so when I saw that, actually, my immediate thought was, okay, so clearly it's the culture. I mean, like, how can you, like, what, married women are smarter? I don't know. It's interesting, though, that some of my colleagues actually looked at that and said, well, it's obviously not the culture. Immediately had a very different reaction to it and believed that it was because married women were more committed than unmarried women. So we actually took a look at that, and we compared married and unmarried women and married and unmarried men on the only thing we really had access to, which was how that might indicate commitment, was how many hours they spent studying, which we asked them to report at the end of each course, on average for that course. And then we controlled for we also asked them how much previous knowledge did you have of the course and so forth. And we found that actually all women studied more than men, but it wasn't just the married women. So single women were actually, it wasn't a lot, it was something like 6 minutes. But was statistically significant that single women were studying more than men, which suggested that that wasn't the problem. So my sense is, it has something to do with this competence-likability trade-off, and also the fact that I think that sexism in our culture in general, and not going to be any different at Harvard Business School, is going to be more likely to be directed toward young single women than young married women. And I think those are the kinds of environments that make it hard to actually thrive and reach your potential. So I think that would be my explanation.
Very interesting. So as you mentioned, HBS is the school that's closest to industry. And are there any plans to take this wonderful research, because the phrase I always heard is we're training the titans of industry. So is there any plan to take what you've learned within HBS with the baby titans in there, to take it out to the big grown-up titans and have them also learn and change from what you have discovered?
Yeah, so I, even though this is one of my administrative roles at this school now, as the Senior Associate Dean for Culture and Community, working on this project, but I think of it as my research. It actually makes me feel better that I'm doing research when I'm doing it. But to me it's action research. It's something that Susan Sturm and I are planning to write about. I shouldn't say that so loud because it's upsetting to some of my colleagues. We are hoping to, and as I said, it's still on the table. So we are beginning to talk about it. I have talked to companies, and I would love, as part of the gender initiative that we've started, which is that's a research initiative. It's outward facing. It has nothing to do with the internal dynamics of our school, but to use that as an opportunity to link up with companies, to work with them around some of the things that we've learned, and perhaps maybe do, even in the form of executive education, but also action research in their companies. So that's the idea.
Great, thank you. And do you think that biotech needs a rallying cry around a lean-in, sort of a Sheryl Sandberg approach. Do you think that we are also not utilizing social media, because that's not our business, where tech companies are very much imbued with the importance of social media? Should we be taking a leaf out of their books and using social media to mobilize, to bring up the problems? Because it really stays within biotech. It hasn't permeated the way that everybody knows the problem in tech. So are these some of the things that might help?
Yeah, so on the rallying cry, I think with the more recent movements that I had mentioned, I do think there's a building swell around that. But in absence of tying it, as we've noted, to the business outcome or some specific sets of data that indicates to your stakeholders why it is you need to do this, I think it will fall flat. So I think a cry that is educated by examples of improved business outcomes, I think could be very powerful, but in that context. On the social media front, I'm sort of two minds. In one sense, I don't necessarily think that the addition of social media will profoundly impact the problem. I think primarily, my view of the biotech, where I operate in the biotech world, which is this early stage little animal, everyone kind of knows everybody. So I'm not sure what the addition of social media would be, because it's such a relatively small club. So I say that acknowledging that we want to try to bring new participants in. And especially, I think there's the additional consideration of the numbers of people in certain age groups within the United States and what the demographics and population of the US look like. And I think getting younger people involved in biotech who may not be the CEOs at the stage that they're at, I think using social media to attract them, and again, on the line of recruitment, pipeline, and providing appropriate sort of mentorship, role models, marketing, I think on that line it could be used. But I'm not enough of a social media or a marketing person
so I'm going to
really comment.
I'm going to push you on that, and maybe it's just my West Coast bias, but the club, the small club, which I know well and I'm part of, yes, they know it and not highly motivated to do a whole lot. But I think when it comes under the bright light of other people who are not insiders, but are actually critical, it might have some kind of impact. And more importantly, for institutional venture funds who have to go to institutions to raise money, unlike the luxury of a corporate venture fund,
Yeah.
I think because it's an ecosystem, I think bringing that more attention might do something. So perhaps you should do a lean-in or a biotech version of whatever the right analogy is.
Mm-hmm. Very fair.
Victoria, we've all talked about the business case. And it's clear that the business case has to be there when you're talking about industry, because policy alone will not fly. Could you describe to us what data you use to make the business case? I've seen the publication on the number of women on boards becoming. That's just one study, though, mm-hmm. and it's the one that I hear over and over again. Is there enough of a body of data that you can muster to make your business case compelling?
It's a really good question. So two things. And before I talk specifically about the business case, I wanted to circle back to one of the discussions that we've had having to do with navigating the system, which is another way of saying fixing the women. And when we talk about women not asking, or women tilting their heads, or women diminishing self when they present, women do this not because they lack confidence, but because they're effective tools for navigating a culture with incredibly high social repercussion. And our studies really show that when women negotiate that first job offer, even if successful, they're viewed as something that rhymes with itch. And it's not just a view, it's actioned in the corporation. People don't want to work with them. Whereas when a man negotiates the first offer, it doesn't in any way conflict with the cultural stereotype of him being a good man. Now, some of my colleagues, like Hannah Riley Bowles, again, looked at what Robin highlighted, which is the why. So what we find is that if we have a conversation, and if I'm talking to Anula and she's the hiring manager, and I use a script that is highly relational, I diminish the backlash effect. If I said, Anula, thank you so much for that offer. I'm incredibly looking forward to working together and being on your team. Do you think we could work together? I know from looking at other industry reports and my background that 10% higher than that offer would seem appropriate. Could we do that together? I'm not saying that's a script one should need, but it is a script which is effective, even for those of us who would say, Anula, I can't imagine working with a woman who's more high-powered and effective in the field. Looking forward to it. I'm worth more. But that script, not helpful. Anti-female in terms of how it lives in people's minds. So I just want us to be conscious in all of our conversation that patterns you see women replicating are there for reasons. And when you're going to change that pattern, you really better understand what is the unintended consequence of that change and why have those patterns been developed, whether that's broadly within the culture or specifically in your organization. If you see women leaving at a particular point, you need to do some good research to understand what's going on at that point. And the whole discussion about opt-out, what we know is women who leave those high-powered positions are not out for more than 2 years at the very outset. They go back in. So what we're not seeing an opt-out. What we're seeing is a push-out and a this isn't working for me, and that's about systems design, and the losers aren't only women who are underemployed. The loser is the firm that invested their time, talent, and money. So, your question about the business case. So, the business case, we have mixed data on women on boards. We have very clear data, think Scott Page, University of Michigan, indicating that when you have complex problems to solve, diversity enables you to do much better outcome production. If you have a complex problem, diversity of field, diversity of experience, diversity of talent, culture, you name it, much more effective. Now, when we talk about a business case, the majority of consumers and consumer decision making, even on things that are thought of as male-oriented tasks like purchasing cars, female. When we think about who is in the control seat, largest growing market in the United States, does anyone know what the demographic is? Shout it out, gals. Not just women, Latina. Every city in the United States, if it isn't already, in the next 10 to 15 years will be majority minority. When you talk about wanting to sell a product or a service in the United States, if you do not understand who the United States is, your business is very unlikely to succeed. When we had the opening discussion and Dan talked about the experience at the FDA, that is the experience of what talent in America is going to look like. Now note, there's some huge downsides to that. It is a crisis that boys are being underserved in school. It's not my area of expertise. It's not something I focus on. There are people who are focused on this. This is an enormous problem. And if you think of how dynamics have played out in particular communities, where you have females who are much more highly educated, who have much higher income levels, who have much greater social mobility, think the African American community in the United States. And now all of those issues which people inappropriately view as focused on that ethnicity. They're focused on what opportunities are and where the gatekeepers have been, and now map that more broadly. These are very serious issues that have to be addressed. However, where we are today, having our conversation about gender and biotech, when we look at what the business case is, the talent management case is very clear, the market share case is very clear, and the efficiency case is very clear. It is expensive to have talent that you've already purchased and invested in and then not fully utilize. You had talked about Amy Cuddy's work on motherhood. This is a perfect example. And we've had a lot of discussion about women's behavioral choices. 2 steps back, these aren't choices. If I give you a menu with 4 things on it, and I say you're welcome to eat any of these 4 for the rest of your life, you would not feel that you made choices. You would feel you selected among a constrained environment. The way most workplaces look in the United States, for most employees, they are selecting among constrained environments. We're the only country in the world that has no mandatory form of paid leave. Workers are not guaranteed by statute a single day of sick leave. Our structural setup creates an inefficiency within our talent market. So we could go on, but that gives you the...
So may I ask you, Robin, do you buy the idea that, Victoria brought up, women are the biggest consumer decision makers in healthcare? They research the web more than 4 times as much as men to get information. They make decisions. They hold the purse, and they also do take care of their kids and their parents. So they are making the majority of decisions. Why has that not become a compelling business case for companies in life sciences to look at that as an area as a target market?
I don't really know.
Okay.
Well, I think there's all the things that we've been talking about, the first panel and the second panel. A lot of it is irrational. I mean, to hold gender stereotypes in the face of reality is irrational. So, that's a longer conversation. What is the unconscious dynamic going on? Why are people so invested in believing that gender stereotypes are true when there's unbelievably little evidence to support it? So, I guess that's what I would.
Thank you. I'm way over time on the panel. May I now invite the audience to pose questions to the panel? So please come up to the microphone and identify yourselves and your affiliation. Thank you. And also feel free to identify the panelists to whom you'd like to address your question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Anamita Das. I'm actually a senior here at Harvard studying economics. Thank you all for coming here and speaking to us. I was wondering, what do you think is the most important for women who are especially in the early stages of their career to know? And what do you think women can do to ensure that they're getting enough guidance and mentorship, especially given that a lot of the people in senior positions are men?
Okay, so 4 quick things. 1, when you seek out networks and mentors and sponsors, you need to find people who don't just look like you. Women tend to benchmark and level set against other people who are like them. Everybody does it, but you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're not getting information from people who may have more access to networks. 2, your job at this stage of life is to make choices that give you as many open doors in the future as possible. So even among specializing, you want to make choices that give you more choices ahead. 3, listen, collect information. However, trust your own instincts and gut. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You are the only person who's the CEO of your life. Admire and respect yourself and figure out what you want to do and pursue it tenaciously. And lastly, Really look at different industries and then different organizations and see how people who do look like you fare there. Don't be deterred, but understand what choices you're making and the amount of tenacity and rallying and resources it may take to achieve there so that you are ready to do it.
I have been a bad moderator in that I have exceeded time. So therefore, could everybody please ask one quick question, and could the answers also be fast? That's my request. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to try. I'm Lauren Surface. I'm a postdoc in systems biology at Harvard. And my question is kind of prompted by Anne's discussion of the market values of biotech recently, and that these people are raking in the cash. And I just was thinking, like, is this the value we need or want to promote? And will women in leadership help us reassess this value? And because, you know, women are like traditionally the subjugated class, and they're subject to the consequences of power. So this is kind of my question.
And
Wow, I feel like I'm loaded either way. So I think I'll answer it this way. People will come to me and say, how do you get a job in venture? Really love technology. I love science. I could sit all day and find like compelling stuff. That's great. And then I have to break it to them. If you're looking for a job in institutional venture, what happens is you need to get someone to write you a check, and you need to hand them cash back, preferably much, much more than what they gave you. Stop. There are some constraints that LPs may put on funds, but by and large, that's the profession. So we'll separate that out. If you look at the pharma and biotech industry, what are they in the business of doing? Well, they need to generate profit and revenue. But the way that they do that is by making products, ideally, that transform patients' lives. So depending on sort of where you are in the context of that organization, I think the Genzyme is a prime example of this. It was, and even the Sanofi CEO who just started about 120 days ago, his first town hall at Genzyme, the Sanofi CEO said to the Genzyme leadership, "You are a mission-driven organization that is very different than what I have seen in other parts of Sanofi. And the mission is patients' lives." So I think depending on where you go in the ecosystem, you can readily understand what is the business outcome they're trying to achieve, and how is it that what are the tools available to them to get there. And I think that might help in making choices.
thank you. I have a question for the organizers. I just want to know whether we can accommodate the long line that's forming there, because if I do any math whatsoever, it's not working out. Okay, so we would please ask no one else to join the line, but we will be delighted to accommodate everybody who's already up there. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name's Daisy. I just defended my PhD at MIT only a couple months ago. My question kind of relates to what we heard in the first panel, which is that women, no matter their attractiveness, are less likely to get funding for their entrepreneurial goals than attractive men overall. So we had a lot of information about the overall big picture, what we can do to improve things in the long term, but more immediately, what can female entrepreneurs do to get their odds to the same level as men? Do you just have to be better no matter what, or can you actually just get an idea that's as good as somebody else and actually have a chance?
Anne?
So I believe, but I will defer to my other colleagues to provide me data support. But I think the evidence is by and large, you do have to be better. Okay. So you've got a bigger job. I'd say from an investment perspective, if the question is around approaching investors, it's a relatively small set of people who are investors. You can usually get to know what it is that investor is about from, for example, find out who else they have invested in. And I would talk with those people in whom they've invested to figure out, like, what is that person about? Because if you take money from someone, you know, you're sort of getting married because at some point money will go back, and you're now in a long-term, if it's venture, you're in at least a sort of a 10-year fund relationship around that money. And ideally, those do become marriages with the wedding day on the day the financing closes. So I think really understanding those investors that you want to approach and who you would contemplate taking their money, I think is an important element. And understanding, I think it's relevant to look in their portfolios to see if they have ever invested in a management team that looks like a team that you think might be reflective of what you want to build.
Thank you.
It's great advice.
Hi, my name is Jen Byerline. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Integration of Science and Industry at Bentley University. And my question goes to what Victoria was talking about with framing. And how do we go from the large tendency to highlight research noting gender inequality to the research that highlights the benefits of gender diversity, and what can we do to promote that feeling in the same way that corporate social responsibility standards helped improve sustainability views in industry?
Great question. A few things are coming. I mean, one, if you look across, if we're thinking about boards, if one looks across Europe and the rest of the world, the reality is there's a huge regulatory frame, and it's coming. Most of the major multinationals, you know, everyone's got a foothold everywhere. Impact and pressures there are going to resonate. What we're also seeing, and I had participated in some of the architecture around, is really looking at, you know, federal contracting. So long story short, you're not out there all alone, and more is going to come, and it's about really knowing the research well and discussing all the facets of it and holding your institutions accountable. Realistically, you are not the only female scientist currently in your field at your program, correct?
No.
Have as many allies, and don't presume men won't be allies. Ask for things in frames which aren't only around gender. Thank the heck out of people when you get what you want, and expect it. And choose wisely which battles you fight. You do not fight battles, in my view, when you're negotiating for a job. You fight battles that you can win then for what you need, and then once you're inside, you work on. I mean, you know, there are times to be rebellious, and rebellious is not when you're negotiating your salary, right? That's a time when you want an external validator.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda Cadegel. I'm a grad student at MIT in computational biology. Thank you to all of the speakers today. We've heard multiple times today about how women experience marriage and motherhood differently than men in the workplace. And I've seen a lot of data recently about millennials and younger generations are ranking this as a lot less important to them for their future. So my question is, what is the situation currently for women who are unmarried or don't have kids, and how do you think that will change as that demographic grows?
Robin, do you have any data on this topic?
Well, I thought you were going to go someplace else. I think, I mean, what I've seen, first of all, is that companies are not, they're not oriented to recognizing or supporting men's very strong commitments to actually being caretakers and not just breadwinners. So I just want to say that, you know, I think if you actually look at what people's experiences, men are having a very hard time, not just millennials, are having a very hard time managing the requirements for professionals that they be available 24/7. I think what I've seen in my research on this among single women is that it's almost as if the organization is sort of set up almost not to recognize the possibility of single women or women without children. And so women they just kind of get grouped together. It's sort of like that's who women are. They're understood as someone who will be, either is a mother and that means a certain thing, or who wants to be and will be a mother. So but your question was, what do you do about that, right? Yeah.
I have an answer to that
Great.
if you want.
I was about to come up with something, but go ahead.
Okay, no, and if you have come up with something, interrupt me.
Yeah, I'll keep them.
No,
Yep.
completely. So one, what we know is narratives are really powerful, and there's going to be a narrative which is laid on you, which is probably inaccurate, and I love the way Robin refers to it as irrational, because it is. So what you have to do is understand the narrative which is laid on you, and the narrative is if you have a child, even if your behaviors change in no way, you are viewed as less committed, less engaged, your pathway to promotion virtually disappears, and the guy down the hall does better. But once you know that, then you know what to do. And the way you inoculate yourself from that is when you're on leave, you have touch points with your manager. When you return, you go in front of them and you say, I'm here, I'm looking, what's my next stretch assignment? Which teams am I going to be on? Which programs, projects am I running? And you define it. Now, people will presume whenever they can't see you that you're with your child. It's bananas, but that's what they presume. So you have to have a narrative where you create an open schedule, right? You paste it on your door. You tell your colleagues, I'm going down the hall to negotiate a deal. You have to be explicit. And much of what this work is when you understand the cultural archetype that's pasted on you, you have to do the work of peeling it off. You have to tell people who you are. I'm organizationally committed. I love being here till 9 o'clock at night. And for me, and to do it authentically. I mean, that's the other thing I would say. This is not a game of showmanship. This is a game of authentically presenting and letting people see you.
Robin, do you have a quick comment?
Well, I guess I understood the question. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought you were saying that as a single woman, not sort of necessarily anticipating that you're going to be in that category, but right now, like you don't have the child, and yet you're going to be perceived as someone who is going to go down that path. So how do you deal with that? I mean, in some ways, I would say something similar to what Victoria said, which is I think you got to resist the pressure. Be aware that that is a stereotype that's going to be put on you, and and I think creating your own story and telling that story. I guess what I would be concerned about is. I see that there can be a kind of a division among women in the workplace between women who have children and women who don't. And so I would just maybe want to say, women find themselves in different situations for all kinds of reasons. Having or not having children is one, being partnered in different ways is another one. But I think it's really important to, even while you're differentiating yourself and saying, this is who I am. These are my commitments. This is what I'm willing to do, to not lose the connection to women who are doing something different.
Thank you. Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Hopkins, a retired professor of biology from MIT, and I'd like to thank the Radcliffe Institute for doing this fantastic symposium and the wonderful panelists. I was totally depressed to hear how much money women aren't raking in.
Me too.
Really sad. But I'm even sadder, actually, about the impact this has within the universities on the women who are interested in biology, including having, really brilliant young women literally break down in your office and say the men go off into their office with the young men in their labs and talk about the biotech companies and leave the women sitting outside. So we've talked about how the women should change, and we've talked about what the companies might do. So I'd like to ask anyone who's willing to answer it, what should the universities do? What is the responsibility? It's not an accident that this industry has grown up around these universities. Same for Stanford. And so, in a sense, I feel that there's some responsibility there. I wonder what you think about that. How they could step in to fix this problem.
I'll just give you one example that I thought was very compelling that came from Berkeley. And Berkeley is not looking at gender, but is looking at the reality that there aren't postdoc positions and faculty positions. And they have started having symposia on campus very frequently for their postdocs and PhD students to meet industry and venture capitalists.
I think when it comes to intellectual property, each discipline defines It's very fascinating. What you do as an engineer, the university owns forever. What you do in things, like anything having to do with biomedical, it appears that one can take it with you. No. I don't know enough about how the OGC manages or does this, but my thought is it would, what would it take? I think we all understand that. It would take the senior tenured faculty to put enormous pressure, having, I'm so aware now that we're cameraed, conversations, thoughtfully with the corporation about what this looks like and what it means. I'm fascinated by your thought about Title IX and Title VII. And I think that is really, Title IX and Title VII are being looked at and actioned right now in a way they haven't been before, that there's all kinds of growing efficacy there.
And do you think that there should be a regulation applied to this space? Is that a good way to deal with the problem? The problem is real.
I think I'll make an observation. So someone's got to take out the license. So it's either the entrepreneur. These days in Boston, a lot of the venture firms are engaged in the early stage formation, and the venture firms are the ones who take out the license from the university. I wonder what would happen if the simple question were asked, can you describe for me the composition on a diversity basis of your venture firm? Or who's going to be responsible for developing whatever you're licensing out? Because we have data and we believe that you're more likely to be successful if you have a diverse team. So I'm not sure about from a policy standpoint, but I think the venture firms that I know in town, one of the venture firms actually on their website, it was great. I hadn't looked at it in a while because I know them. And I was surprised to see that there were a bunch of women on the website. And I was like, what? Like, who are these people? Like I have never encountered them, and I see these guys on like a multiple times a week basis. And they had actually put up all their admins. Anyway, sorry, sidebar, and perhaps I should have turned off my microphone.
That is actually very common practice when VC firms put their admins on. Should have turned off my microphone
for that one. But I can imagine, what would that conversation look like, even if it wasn't a policy, if the simple question were asked, can you tell me about the diversity of the team that's responsible for making good on the license I'm about to give you? Because we have data, and we believe it's more likely to be successful if you have a diverse group. That's where I might just start the conversation, because someone might just take notice.
Thank you, Anne. It's a good answer.
Great. Thank you all so much. My name's Teresa Nelson. I'm a professor in the School of Management at Simmons College, and really glad to be here. I'm going to sort of resonate to Anne's point about the strength of biotech in Boston, and what an important factor it is that we are here, and this is happening right here as a world standard. And also referring to her comment about the get-it-dones, because there's a group of people here across the ecosystem in academia and entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who would like to take some action around this topic. And we've been talking about it for about 2 years, and what we've come up with, we're going to begin to actualize, I believe, in the spring, and would love to get people's senses of it. And it really has to do with understanding the fact that the pipeline, as Nancy said, in biology and academic medicine is so strong with women. What an enormous achievement this is compared to 20 and 25 years ago, referring to Victoria's comments. And we have been wondering whether women in the early stages of their PhDs, as well as PhD students, postdocs, and those in early science careers are really aware of their career options in terms of commercialization, in terms of the protection of their intellectual property, in terms of licensing. Where's the expert net for them to reach out to, and to really understand, that they have choices to make around commercialization. So we're imagining this has to be something that happens outside of the major teaching institutions, perhaps, and that this is a way to really start a question so that women in science have enough of the business entrepreneurship side as well. And so I'd just love to get your thoughts on that.
Teresa, are you going to be around for a glass of wine?
Okay. Thank you for your patience. This is the last question. Yes. Yes. I was acknowledging you and saying thank you for being
okay. I'm
for your
Cassandra
patience.
Smith. This morning, I don't remember who said it, but alluded to the fact that women have more choices than men. But they were referring to children, not to adults. And my observation is actually women have a much narrower cone of acceptability in behavior than men. And in fact, again, it's my observations that women are, if they kind of step out of this, are much more subjected to criticism or corrections. And I think that's what influences women from speaking, for instance, at faculty meetings or at meetings like this. So any comments, because the only comments thus far in the meeting were on young children, that women, females, girls had more choices than boys.
I think it's actually true for adults too, but it's a little bit complicated. I think the research suggests that men will be punished more for violating the masculine stereotype and evidencing feminine behavior, and women are punished less. They're punished, but it is more of a violation for men to go in that direction. So I think that's true of adults as well. I think what you're probably noticing is that the domains within which women are circumscribed are these public ones, and so we see it, and that's what we're all here being concerned about. So, but I think if you looked at men's violations in the other direction, it just doesn't tend to be public. And when it is public, it's pretty severely punished. And there's a lot of man-on-man sexual harassment, and violations of gender roles those are the people who end up getting sexually harassed, both men and women. But I think it's not just children. But that's my.
Thank you, Robin. We are 15 minutes over, so we really must stop. And Janet, please.
I'll just...
thank you. Let me just thank the panel. Yeah. And Janet will... And thank the audience. Thank you, audience, for hanging in there for so long. And Janet, please.
Yeah, I want to thank you all, thank the panel and the earlier panel. This was an incredibly interesting day. Even if you're not in biotech, I think you can really see the biotech leadership and the biotech boards as something of a litmus test of where gender relations stand in our society. This is an industry that is less than 50 years old. And you could argue that its leaders are of an age where they should know better than this. And yet it is one of the biggest, most lavish boys' clubs we have around. So I am glad on many levels that we've come here together to talk about it. Today we've highlighted the bias, the gender bias, the irrational, the implicit bias that underlies much of that. I was very grateful for Allison's data, which, while profoundly disturbing, is still validating because it really reflects what many of us still do experience. We've also talked about the internal conflicts that women highlight and cite, family as priority and that conflict. We've talked a bit about pulling way back and seeing that not necessarily as simply the choices of individual women, but as systems problems. You'll remember the phrase, the personal is political. The personal is corporate. These are systems design problems. We've also highlighted some of the behaviors that might be necessary for women's success. Demanding, giving time, perhaps volunteering, tilting your head, and also the conflict between what may be the behaviors and the affect needed for survival versus that which is ultimately needed for success. I think this adds up to a danger of almost a John Henryism. Those of you who are sociologists will recognize that term. It was coined by Sherman James to describe the attitude among some minority citizens that they have to work harder to get to the same place that majority citizens do, even if it comes at a cost to their health. The tale, the reference is to a tale, a folk tale, about an African-American railroad man, a steel driver, who vowed that he could beat the steam engine with his muscles and with his hammer to drive a tunnel through a mountain. And he went up against this steam engine, and damn it, he won. But he died with the hammer in his hand. I would say that the modern day equivalent is that badass woman who's working 2 shifts. She's working all day at the biotech firm, and she's going home to work with her family. She may get to that C-suite, but she's got a briefcase on one shoulder and a diaper bag on the other shoulder. It describes the way it is, but it doesn't have to describe the way it should be. I think we've talked about making change that isn't just about navigating the system or fixing the women, but really about changing the system. We've talked about really making clear the value proposition of having women who stay. Inviting women in, having them stay. The burden of proof, unfortunately, I think, is on us. We are the minority in this situation, but we need to make that case. We need to make it clearly. We've talked about change we must make. We've talked about how that is deep, ongoing, transformational work, to use Robin's phrase, and we need to define what is actionable change that we can demand. I'll just finish by saying, at the break, I needed to draft these remarks, so I went out back in the hallway there, and a young woman who I couldn't see was out there too, clearly calling her partner about, it looks like this conference is going to go long. Can you pick Alexandra up at daycare? I didn't see you. I don't know if you were here. Oh, that was you! I was going to say, is I hope whoever you are, you're still here, because we need you. We need every one of you. We need you and your talent. So thank you for being here. Thanks for joining the discussion with me.